Yeah.
And it seems that this unique global event, the pandemic, brought together so many convergent interests, a desire for the increased ability to surveil, the desire for more control in populations that are increasingly harder to control when there are counter narratives, the ability to censor more, the ability for big pharma to make profits. It seemed like so many things came together simultaneously that the facts were being lost, massaged, manipulated, neglected, negated, and that clearly happens in the pharmaceutical industry anyway. As my limited understanding of how drugs are trialed, they can do numerous tests until they get the results that they want. They can white label products. There's all sorts of ways around it. Yep. It doesn't seem like one of the things I think that's made you so appealing and successful is that it seems that at the heart of what you're doing is what is best for people's health, and that should be the pulse, the beating heart of medicine, ought be wellness, a sort of a Hippocratic interest in serving people and helping people, and of course not harming people. And it seems that as much as interests have coalesced around this, controversy has, and because of the nature of media now, because of the ability of independent voices, even in the face of some censorship, to communicate openly, the kind of questions that are being raised, it seems to me, are now unignorable. It seems to me that the narrative and understanding of the pandemic is shifting. Do you sense that with all of the adverse events, with the excess deaths, with the information coming out about clinical trials, with the Pfizer profits, with Moderna pushing 4,000% markup on prices? Are you starting to think that people have changed their opinion? And also, this is psychologically, so it's somewhat abstract. How do you think people are going to adjust to recognizing that this was a period in history that was very badly handled, and that there's almost, I would say at this point, a requirement for a reckoning, an investigation at very least?
Oh, there certainly is. Now, I mean, we would expect vested interests from the pharmaceutical industry. They are there absolutely at the end of the day to make money. That's what you would expect. But we're talking here about our regulatory authorities. Now, we used to trust these regulatory authorities. We thought they had our best interests at heart. But it appears that they have these conflicts of interest that just are, to my mind, is not acceptable. What I'm interested in doing is preventing disease if possible and treating it as cheaply as possible if we possibly can. So the vitamin D example, you can go to the supermarket, you can buy vitamin D tablets, and they're $1.50 for a tub. So, we're talking about a really cheap intervention here. Whereas all the new pharmaceuticals that are coming along, the new ones are expensive. And it very often is that you need to take a tablet a day for the rest of your life. So there's kind of a long-term market strategy here. They're going to be selling these for a long period of time is what they want to do. But these people should be getting regulated. And in my view, they're just not being adequately regulated. But it's not just that, it's the knowledge as well, how we know things. So if you're in an argument with a doctor, what you'll often say is, well, if you've got a randomized double-blind controlled trial evidence of that. Well, actually, a lot of the time, I'm afraid we don't, because randomized double-blind controlled trials are conducted essentially entirely by the pharmaceutical industry. They cost probably upwards of $10 million each. So who's going to bother doing a randomized double-blind controlled trial on vitamin D or ivermectin or other repurposed drugs that are probably very, very efficacious for various conditions, because they're not under patents anymore. You can't make any money. So Santoshi Omura's institution in Japan, he discovered ivermectin. His institution in Japan offered Merck their facilities to run a randomized double-blind controlled trial at the start of the pandemic on ivermectin. And of course, Merck didn't want to, because there was no... Well, I can't say why Merck didn't want to, but Merck didn't want to.
I might posit that it's because it's not a profitable medicine. And the hysteria that surrounded that conversation was, I think, one of the moments where we came to recognize what was happening in that pandemic, that there was a form of media totalitarianism and the assertion of establishment control that, if it was taking places under the guises of another ideology, would be called out for what it was: hysteria. I was thinking that the way that you just described that double-blind trial process as being an expensive, costly one, and therefore necessarily under the auspices of a profit-driven model, only undertaken in pursuit of profits. That's, that's not even a moral and ethical issue. If something was so tightly bound, for example, by Sufism or some Christian sect, you'd call it crazy. We're not going to carry out that trial. It doesn't prove that Sufism works, or it doesn't prove that supporting West Ham United is the only way to follow football. You would call it mad. But because it's an economic ideology, no one's questioning it. And in a sense, that's what is at the heart of this. Power, dominion, finance, and increasingly we're seeing this modality mapped onto reporting. Because of course what you're doing is reporting, essentially, from a firm platform and basis of medical understanding, and with a demeanour that I imagine many people find appealing, because it isn't presumptuous, it's not condescending, it's open and ethical, it seems to me at least. But ultimately, this has become something that's difficult to achieve. Both you and I, on some platforms, have experienced pushback and consequences. Both of us have been called conspiracy theorists and crackpots. And even legitimate voices like, well, you tell me, are voices like that of Peter McCulloch and Dr. Robert Malone, are these voices that in a genuine scientific discourse ought to have been included, and was an early warning sign that something unusual was happening, the exclusion of certain data? And what's that thing, the Barraclough report, or whatever it's called, the Barrington report?
The Great Barrington Declaration.
Yeah, when that kind of stuff started getting excluded from the conversation, and those revelations around Fauci's emails, the fact that there were 3 theories at the beginning, and then all of a sudden they just stopped talking about 2 of them, and the fact that Wuhan does have ties to the EcoHealth Alliance, all of this accumulative information, what does it suggest to us about the driving force behind the narrative, the driving force behind policy, and the exclusion of certain voices from media?
Yeah, there's no question that there's been a particular narrative. We've been able to see that. If we take the BBC, for example, they've had a particular line all the way through this pandemic. And, argument against that really hasn't been allowed. And again, big tech have had a particular narrative, and you're not really allowed to argue with that big tech narrative. Now, even if these people are wrong, if they're putting forward science, if they're putting forward sensible ideas, then they should be allowed to do that. They should be allowed to publish that, because a lot of medical publications now are controlled to quite a large extent. A lot of peer-reviewed papers are actually ghost-written by pharmaceutical industries. The very trials that are done, of course, the pharmaceutical industry can do some trials and choose not to do other trials.
Yeah.
So the data that we get out from this is only what they've decided to put into the system in the first place. But we've got people like those scientists you mentioned, our mutual friend, Dr. Aseem Malhotra, for example, who's actually in India advocating against the use of mass vaccination in India as we speak. When people like that are putting forward ideas, they've earned the right to be heard. And they're putting forward scientific ideas, and they're putting forward scientific data. So for potential scientific data to be rejected out of hand before it's been analysed, before it's been critiqued, because it doesn't fit with a particular narrative, is a form of intellectual fascism. It's saying who can speak and who can't speak. And that's a fundamental issue. Anyone putting forward a legitimate scientific argument should be able to publish that, should be able to debate it, and should be able to do so freely. And the argument should be based on the content of the argument, not on the man. So play the ball, not the man. Very often people have a go at me all the time, of course. It doesn't bother me too much. But really, it would be much better if they focused on my arguments. Your data says this other data says this. How do you reconcile those two? It is a completely legitimate thing to say. But we've got all these people. I mean, I talked at the start of this pandemic to the leading physician in the state, one of the leading respiratory physicians in the state, Dr. Pierre Corey. He testified to Senate about the use of steroids in COVID. That was taken on. I did a video with Dr. Pierre Corey on steroids. It's still on YouTube now. You can see it. The use of steroids has saved millions of lives in the pandemic. He then testified to Senate about ivermectin. That got immediately 10 million views on YouTube. Then it was taken down. He did a video with me, and his arguments were eloquent. They were consistent with his many years of medical expertise. He cited other medical experts. Of course, that video was taken down because it didn't quite fit the narrative. You've got people of the calibre of Dr. Tess Lawrie, who I interviewed as well. She did the original Cochrane data review on ivermectin, found it was efficacious, sent it in, it was rejected. She couldn't quite work out why it was being rejected. It's because it didn't fit this narrative. So we've got Professor Norman Fenton, again a statistician of international renown, putting forward data, but the data is being rejected because it doesn't fit the narrative, and that's not acceptable. If we're going to deny the nature of scientific reality, then why do we bother having scientists? We're not going to listen to them. We might as well go back to the Stone Age, and that's what we're doing. Scientific information, the axioms of science, like we talked about in the basic physiology, the data, it's all being ignored or suppressed if it doesn't fit a particular narrative, rather than an open dialectic debate, which is what we need.
In fact, there are still videos up from much earlier in the pandemic where you can see people say, not just people, presidents, prominent newscasters saying, take this vaccine, you won't get this thing, and you won't be able to spread it, it stops with you. Transmission seems to be another area where there was a degree of opacity that seems irresponsible, and a lot of the social leverage that was offered was around a kind of a public duty, which for me was a very effective method of communication, because if you believe, as obviously you do, in the sort of sanctity, significance and beauty of human life, then protecting other people, protecting the more vulnerable, is a significant push to take a medication not for your own health but for somebody else's health. And yet it seems that even that assertion is not one that can be made on a scientific basis.
Certainly not now. Again, in the earlier stages of the pandemic, there was some evidence of that. But what's been really disappointing in the pandemic is how quickly any protection has waned. Now, the idea that you have the vaccine and the infection stops with you, that was always nonsense.
That was always nonsense.
Yeah, nothing is 100% effective in medicine. The only thing that's sure in life is death and taxes, isn't it? It was never 100%. But as time going on, it's become patently clear that is not the case. So now, if you are vaccinated, you probably are going to spread the disease a little less for a short period of time, but only for a very short period of time, probably only about 10 or 15%. It's essentially a negligible effect. So this emotional blackmail that you should have your shot to protect your granny, really, why did people say that when it was patently untrue? After the first few months, we knew that wasn't true, and that's another problem with the pandemic. As time has gone on, the data that was collected is no longer being collected. So the Office for National Statistics, for example, every 2 months, absolutely religiously, publish deaths by vaccination status. So how many people are dying, were they vaccinated or not? So that was published every 2 months, sometimes every 6 weeks, up until the 31st of May 2022. They stopped publishing it then. Now, the data before then was showing that the vaccine effect was waning quite dramatically. But for 8 months now, having published it religiously every 2 months, but for 8 months now, we've had no data at all. So we don't know who is dying in the UK by vaccination status. They stopped publishing that data. Now, why did they stop publishing that data? We don't know. It does seem a bit strange that they were meticulous about it every 2 months. We know that the ONS is still being funded by the government to the tune of several £1 million a month, but they're not producing that data. We need to know deaths by vaccination status because we know the efficacy of the vaccine wanes with time. We know that it's not really preventing transmission in any serious way. We know that the vaccine protection against severe illness, hospitalisation and death wanes with time. But at the same time, we know that because there's such a high prevalence of COVID in the community, that you and I are constantly being reinfected. We know that's boosting our mucosal immunity and we're getting this constant top-up. So we're still getting this narrative where the natural immunity is being ignored. The vaccine benefits are being talked up dramatically. But how many people are dying by their vaccination status has been ignored for the last 8 months. If we had that data, it used to be published in spreadsheet form. It was still published. Then people like Professor Fenton are chomping at the bit to analyse that data. But it hasn't been published. We simply don't know what it is. Why has that not been published is a very interesting question.
On the spectrum of how this pandemic could have been conveyed to the public, the evolving story, where between it would have been better if they'd just done nothing at all, not had vaccines, not done lockdowns, not done masks, and certain portions of the population, people with respiratory conditions, people that were vulnerable, comorbidities, whatever. Like, where do you feel that you are, or is that too complex? Because like sometimes the part of me that is just radical in my sort of, I don't know, my sort of my MO, so it feels like, would this have been better if they'd just not done anything? Or would this have been better if they'd have sort of from the beginning been explicit, like if you're like it seems now, like, and also is that kind of discourse impossible when you have the kind of interests at play, the kind of funding that's at play, the kind of agenda to introduce further surveillance, further ability to control digital passports? These are not conspiracy theories, it's sort of well published, well understood information. Where do you sort of fall on that?
You know, in the early stages of the pandemic, Boris Johnson said it's necessary to flatten the sombrero. So we're having this big spike in cases. And I think we did need to get it down because at the time there was a lot of unknowns. And if it had turned out that this disease had something like a 5% mortality rate, we really didn't know at the time because the data coming out of China was completely useless. We knew that at the time. If it had turned out to have a high mortality rate and they'd done nothing, then of course that would have been negligent. So we did need to prevent the transmission of the SARS coronavirus in the early stages of the pandemic, during the Wuhan wave and arguably during the Alpha wave in the earlier waves. I think that was necessary to do that to some extent. Now, of course, it's utterly changed. So were some measures necessary in the first early stages of the pandemic? Yes. Did the hand hygiene work? Probably not at all. Did the mask wearing work? Well, pretty minimal, really. But the social isolation did. That did prevent the transmission. Now, there was a time when a lot of people were being admitted to hospital all at the same time. And if we'd had a situation where people were queuing up ill outside hospitals, that would have not been good for the people and it would have been politically embarrassing. And if we'd let the disease just run rip in the early stages of the pandemic, that could have happened and more people, I think, would have died. But there's no question now that, of course, the lockdown measures now that's completely past. Of course, we need to promote natural immunity now because we're entering this period of endemicity. The risk-benefit analysis, as you've rightly said, if 1 in 800, 1 in 1,000 people get severe adverse events of special interest to the vaccine, and we need to vaccinate tens of thousands to prevent one hospitalisation. The risk-benefit analysis has clearly changed. I believe we should absolutely stop the vaccine now, stop the restriction measures now. Quite when that changed over is a bit of a trickier question. It changed over earlier than I recognise, which I quite honestly regret now. So I had, as I said, I had my last vaccine at the end of 2021. I should have realised more in autumn 2021. But when it became absolutely clear was in the Omicron era. When the Omicron was giving us the natural immunity, the risks were way less, but the risks from vaccination and lockdown measures remained the same.
What I would offer there is that when you have lobbying as a sort of just a normalized component of conventional US politics and politics elsewhere, when you have bodies like the WHO that are funded by organisations that appear to have a vested interest in particular outcomes, and to be less cryptic, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation heavily invest in the WHO. Similarly, they invest in numerous vaccine programs, and similarly, there are organisations that they fund the WHO, so their impact and influence cannot be overstated. It's difficult when there is a pivotal moment, even if you don't take a sort of an adverse or an inverse and proportional reaction of like never trust anyone, never do anything, like, you know, which is sort of almost my pathology, Doctor. It seems that much earlier, as you have just explained, the Omicron phase, with a true objectivity, what could have happened then is, listen, we can radically reevaluate this. Also, because of what's happening culturally, it became sort of unduly politicized and attached to ideological ideas that are absolutely nothing to do with medicine at all, that were to do with liberalism and conservatism, both of which are ultimately framed within such a narrow economic framing anyway, that they amount to pretty neutered and muted ideologies when it comes to what's required to change the world. So it's been an extraordinary period for learning for our species, I suppose, because it is a pandemic. It was an opportunity to look at the planet as a whole and to look at human nature and to look at our institutions and to look at power dynamics. And I think that your role in helping reason, rationale, medicine, duty stay central to that, I think is incredibly significant and important. Thank you for that, Doctor. Thanks for your diligence and your duty.
And I actually feel a bit better in some ways because I feel like now I'm more in contact with the reality. 2 years ago, would have said I'm now more cynical. But I actually now do think there is a lot of vested interest at government level, at corporate level, at what you might call the philanthropy level, at the whole control level. And that doesn't always, in fact, you could argue that most of the time, that doesn't operate in the interest of the ordinary people, because healthcare should be of the people, for the people, by the people. That's what it should be.
Yes, it should be. And it shows you that, look, sometimes we lose heart, I think, because there's so much cynicism and so much suspicion and sometimes anger towards the institutions. But actually, institutions, whilst there is a sort of a systemic, almost algorithmic consciousness that takes place within these institutions, they are ultimately human beings as well. And if there are human beings that are corrupted, then that situation can be uncorrupted, but we can reassess the type of institutions and the type of individuals we endow with power. If we can envisage for a moment an Anthony Fauci that was as devoted to data and research as you are, then the public response to the pandemic in the United States would have been in keeping with the narrative that you've described. Oh, it seems like a sensible thing to do initially. Hold on, we've got more data. We need to address this. No, not young people. Hey, let's look at these adverse events. But that's simply not what happened, because the truth was too bloody inconvenient to be addressed, and so many factors came together. So thanks so much.